Hello, I'm Juliet Mann, and this is the Agenda podcast, CGTN Europe's one-stop shop for smart, in-depth discussion of the issues that really matter in the world today. Few issues dominate headlines across Europe and indeed across the world, like immigration. Approaches to immigration are a major political issue across the continent as security concerns, a tough economic climate, disillusionment with governing parties and the rise of the far right join together to harden attitudes against those looking for a better life. So what's the solution to Europe's migrant crisis? Joining me now are Heaven Crawley, former director of the Migration for Development and Equality Hub, Dr. Paolo Novak, co-director of the Centre for Migration and Diaspora Studies at SOAS at the University of London, and Klaus Jurgens, director of EconomyFirst. Thank you all for coming on the agenda. Heaven, let me start with you, because Donald Trump said at the UN last month that Europe is in serious trouble in terms of illegal immigration. But then we look at the data, and that seems to show the opposite. I mean, the UNHCR saying that there's been a dramatic drop in arrivals on asylum routes. So how big an issue is this?
So I think Donald Trump said a lot of things at the UN that are simply not true, and his comments with regard to illegal migration in Europe are among them. So illegal migration, or irregular migration as we prefer to call it, is falling, not rising, as you rightly said. Irregular crossings at the borders fell by about a third in the first quarter of this year, and total irregular entries into Europe have dropped by something between 30 and 40% in the last year or so. So I think it's simply untrue that the number of illegal migrants is growing. It's also really important to point out that legal migration really dwarfs illegal migration by a factor of about 1 to 10, in fact. So there are around 45 million non-EU citizens legally living in the EU, and really between about 3 and 4 million who are considered to be irregular. So again, the scale of the problem as it's being presented is simply not in line with what the statistics are telling us. I think the other thing to say that's really important, and I'm sure we'll come into it in the conversation, is that those regular migrants, who are the vast majority, are actually contributing hugely to Europe's economy, not just in terms of its hospitals and its care homes, which we hear a lot about, but also in terms of the IT sector, in terms of agriculture. You know, in many ways, Europe needs migrants more than migrants need Europe, not least because we have an aging population. So I think the kind of story of Europe being in trouble is much more a political one than it is an economic one, in truth.
I mean, Paolo, it is complex, and it's certainly complex and different from country to country. What would you say are the underlying causes of migration, for good or for bad?
Yeah, I mean, that's, in a sense, the million-dollar question that has all migration scholars and policymakers awake at night. I mean, on one side, it's a question that it's very easy to answer. You open any newspaper, no doubt your program, your TV channel continuously tell us about the causes of migration. We live in the age of televised genocide. We have wars and conflicts in nearly every region of the world, in fact, in every region of the world. Land grabs, environmental degradation, climate transformation. I mean, these are all, causes of migration as such, and it's not surprising that there should be people on the move. In fact, the question to me would be, why aren't there more people on the move considering all of this? It's quite different if you move away from migration and think about migrants themselves. I mean, if we humanize migration, the answer to your question becomes much more difficult because it becomes difficult to generalize. So, all of us move for reasons of love, care, aspiration, desire, whim, in a sense. So migrants, they do not just react to crisis, but, they are part of our social life. And again, from this perspective, what we need to explain is not so much what causes migration, but what causes, all the problem or migration being seen as a problem.
So, Klaus, if the big migration picture hasn't changed, but based on what we're saying here in terms of conflicts raging, political upheaval, economic uncertainty, and then, of course, things like love, is the way the likes of the EU are dealing with immigration changing?
Well, that's a good point. Recently, I did a program for a European TV station, a quite big one, and we focused on Syrian migrants in Austria. Now, that is a topic you would believe a hot pick. And it was exactly the week when the Austrian government had decided that, technically speaking, residence permits can be questioned, might not be renewed, or might not be given at all. And they started actually by saying that family members are no longer allowed to join you automatically. All has watered down a little bit, public outcry, but it's still not done, because they say Syria is a safe country, please go home. Now, this is one thing. If for 1 minute, you might be surprised, UK and Germany and binational, what have you. Now, Austria has a far-right movement. I will come back to that. And they recently complained that teaching Turkish at the lower level schools, not the tertiary education, but the middle schools and the primary schools, doesn't make sense, because people have to learn to speak German. And I so wholeheartedly acted against this in public as well. And I said, no, please, a mother tongue is a mother tongue, and then you integrate by learning a second language. Don't deny anyone that right. You asked, is the picture changing in Europe? Due to far-right extremism, as I would call it very openly. You can censor me, but of course you don't. But I'm very, very outspoken about this. It is very seldom the left these days criticizing migration. It is pretty much the right and the extreme right, and for all the wrong reasons. My esteemed colleague just mentioned here Heaven before. Yes, Europe benefits from migration because we have a Fachkräftemangel, as we call it. We don't have enough skilled or semi-skilled workers. It would be a win-win-win situation. Give them education, give them jobs, and let them come. Yes, of course not 20 million into a 1 million country, of course not. Sort of kept migration, but being a humanitarian role model would suit the EU quite well. Yes, but changing parameters, unfortunately. Yeah.
So, Heaven, we're hearing thereabouts of changing sentiments, but in terms of strategy, how would you characterise the EU's strategy here?
Well, I think, as already has been alluded to, it's somewhat of a paradox, because on the one hand, it spends literally billions trying to keep people out. And as has been mentioned, this kind of agenda on the far right is not really particular to any country anymore. And yet, at the same time, Europe depends upon migrants to keep its economy running. So it's not really a crisis of numbers, but a kind of crisis of political and policy imagination. And I say that as someone who's been working in this space for 35 years and has seen just this progressive erosion of rights and responsibility when it comes to migration over time. So we talk about this as being a current crisis. Well, we've been talking about a crisis since 2015. We were actually talking about a crisis in the late 1980s when it came to the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. The framing of crisis is really what dominates the EU strategy, if you like. So what we have really is a strategy that's focused on keeping people out, on controlling the flows, and on shifting responsibility increasingly to countries outside of its borders. So, for example, back in the late 1990s, when Tony Blair came into power in the UK, he talked about the externalization of migration processing. And now we have, for example, Italy doing the same in terms of sending people to be processed in Albania. We have deals across the EU with Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Mauritania, and Turkey, all about exchanging money and training and equipment for migration control, essentially. And so whilst the EU calls this a kind of orderly migration, in practice, what it is a very heavy filtering out of people's ability to even get into the country through a sort of tighter border controls and speeding up deportations. And it's very selective. So some countries are trying to, have policies in place to be able to bring people in, because in truth, they know that they can't manage without migration. But politically, the talk, the rhetoric, the media coverage is all about control. And I think this is one of the problems we have, and we've had for decades, is that nobody is politically brave enough to be able to talk about the reality, about the fact that migration is simply not going to stop and there's no turning back the clock. And so what can you do to manage this migration in a way that is effective and meaningful for the people who move, with all these aspirations we've been hearing about, but also, enables Europe to have the sort of control that it wants? And I think the first thing that needs to happen is a different political tone, and one more realistic and open about why we need migration.
Klaus, let's talk about the UK. I mean, not a day goes by when this story isn't in the headlines. You know, it's a really hot button issues. Tensions are running extremely high. What do you think needs to be done in the United Kingdom?
Now, I made a very, very straightforward comment. I said, look, the winter fuel payments have been kept and then they were reinstated. Taxes might be rising, might not be rising, what have you. You know, the new government in the last almost a year is trying this and trying that, but the people are actually sometimes do not know how to put a square meal on the table of their family at the end of the month. And I'm not joking. I'm not talking about your average unemployed for 20 years person. You know, the middle classes are starting to suffer. And then I said in a little cynical tone, look, what would you do? You're struggling to make ends meet. Then all of a sudden, in the hotel opposite you, a 3- or 4-star hotel run by a British chain, no more tourists are coming there. No one is coming there except for migrants paid for by the government without any asylum process, staying there for a couple of years, free meals, free food, free nothing. And then all of a sudden they forgot to train them, to integrate them into the society, by all means offer English language courses and give them their human dignity back. And if someone has a human dignity, they usually contribute to society. Now, you asked about the UK, and I'm definitely not on the far right side, no. But I do understand ordinary citizens who are slowly, step by step, getting more worried about the numbers of migrants we can actually absorb. I call it the absorption capacity. It's a technical term about fellow human beings you should not use, but it is a point. And we have to come to a point that there must be a fair distribution process within the European Union. Now, of course, the UK is no longer part of the European Union. Let's make a bilateral agreement. It is not easy. Talking about fellow citizens is never easy, but I do understand a certain resentment amongst absolutely ordinary, not far-right voters in the UK who say, hey, they get it all for free and I can't even feed my family.
That's the UK. Let's talk about Germany. Paolo, let me bring you back in here, because we've been talking about immigration as not being a new thing. And after the immigration crisis in 2015, Germany's then Chancellor, Angela Merkel, famously declared, "Wir schaffen das," we can do it, interpreted by many as extending open arms to asylum seekers. But that sentiment has very much changed, hasn't it, with concerns over migration becoming a major political issue?
I mean, completely. I mean, 2015 was a pivotal year, and you can interpret that year, I would say, from many different perspectives. It was certainly the height of what was called then, and it seems we are calling it back like this, the migration crisis. There were over 1.2 million, if I'm not wrong, first-time asylum seekers, i.e. people arriving irregularly or being irregularized into asylum seekers. There were over 4,000 deaths in the Mediterranean alone. You know, all governments were kind of frantically innovating the way in which their administrative and legal procedures for dealing with asylum seekers could function. And it was also the year, in fact, now that I remember, it was also the year of the Greek referendum, where, you know, that deep integration between financial crisis, migration crisis, the crisis of Europe at large was very evidently part of the political debate. You know, it was also the year, from a different perspective, that activists and critical scholars called the long summer of migration. Because ultimately, the way in which I see, you know, Angela Merkel's intervention was a recognition that the EU border had broken down. You know, the force of migration, the force of activism across Europe had made, you know, the border fall apart. And this was a recognition. So if we think back 10 years ago, you know, that it's unprecedented, the amount of change. You know, the EU border through, you know, Heaven was talking about externalization, offshoring of detention, has somewhat kind of reconstituted its containment functions. What has more dramatically changed is the terrain in which the political debate takes place nowadays. We have, you know, far-right, white suprematist theories, replacement theory, remigration, that have become legitimate, quote unquote, part of the political debate and have been brought into the political debate by parties that are now in the mainstream. So the terrain, what is allowed to be said and discussed, has dramatically changed.
Heaven, there does seem to be a hardening of migration policy Europe-wide, but some countries are doing things differently, like Spain, with a radically different approach that really does seem to make business sense, just like you were talking about earlier. I mean, Spain's economy expanded by 3.2% last year, outpacing Germany, France, Italy and the UK. And analysts credit much of that growth to tourism, but to immigrants too. So what's your take on the Spanish approach?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. In the same way that Germany's economy increased by 2.2% after the Syrian refugees arrived in 2015, 2016, we see an absolute correlation between migration and economic growth. I think, as you said, Spain stands out in Europe because it treats, for the moment at least, migration as an economic asset rather than a security threat. And whilst the rest of Europe has really hardened its stance, Spain, at least for the moment, has pursued this kind of rather pragmatic regularization and integration approach, which it also did actually in the 1990s, and it's paying off economically. So the idea that rather than pushing people into routes where they find it very difficult to regularize their status, I mean, this idea that people want to be illegal, it's absolutely not the case. Everybody wants to be in the system, not least so that they can work, support themselves. They have no desire to be on benefits, in my experience, and they want to support themselves and their families. So this approach that Spain has taken is really about increasing the amount of legal pathways for migrants who are coming for work, and also, as has been mentioned previously, increasing the possibility of integration. So, you know, this idea that somehow migrants want to be stuck in a hotel for 2 years waiting for their claim to be processed is simply not desirable on the part of the migrants either. They want to be part of the society. They want to be able to contribute in the ways that they are able to do so. And as I said earlier, you know, 9 out of 10 people are in that position because they're here legally. So the sort of story of the asylum hotels in that sense is a little bit of a red herring, even though it may be politically very important. So I think Spain is doing some really important things, and it's because it's showing that migration could be an engine of growth, not a crisis to contain. It's because it's got this political leadership that those practical things become possible. And I think, in a way, it's not just about policy, it's about having the political bravery, for want of a better word at the moment, to be able to say, look, this is the situation, this is the reality in which we live, where we have a more globalized world. We also have a world in which migration is very critical for development. You know, a third of migration is between the countries of the global south. So this idea, instead of migration being a threat, it being an opportunity, that's politically what has enabled Spain to do things differently. Portugal have tried and been, you know, successful on some fronts, but there's a real kind of, you know, a push against anything more progressive. And as I say, I've been doing this for 35 years, and it simply hasn't worked, the containment approach. So at some point, we need to sort of start thinking politically how to do things differently.
Well, Klaus, Heaven there is talking about opportunities, and yet some countries are trying to make themselves less attractive to migrants. Italy wants to outsource processing to Albania, for example, although that move is being blocked. And of course, the government in the UK tried to send illegal migrants to Rwanda, the last government anyway, didn't they? Are schemes like that inevitably doomed to failure?
I think so. Yes, and I may add another country. The previous government, for example, not in Germany but in Austria, was floating exactly the same ideas. We will have asylum seekers processing centers anywhere but on European Union soil. Now, fair enough if they think this will speed up things, but I said this is treating people in two different classes. This is even making their situations worse. Putting them into a camp or what have you, and then say, look, now you have to wait until you're processed or not. No, the right to asylum is a human right. And as my previous speaker said, no one does this for fun. There are dire personal situations which lead someone to leave their homelands. It might be civil war, it might be a famine, it might be an attack on themselves, it might be political upheaval, yes. But this notion of people are leaving their homelands only for economic reasons because you earn more money in the UK or in France or in Germany, I think for the time being, this is no longer true. Then you go via the marriage system, then you get your education accredited, and then you just come on the student visa, and then you live happily. We are talking about people who need our help. They need humanitarian support. Yes, of course, you're absolutely right. Them declaring we send them to Rwanda or we build camps in other countries far away from our shores. Albania is, of course, not far away from our shores, but staying in the picture. I think this was ludicrously wrong, and I'm almost going to say, luckily, these attempts are failing and hopefully will have failed.
Okay, so Paolo, how could the EU do more to tackle the root causes that we're talking about here? Or do you think failed interventions in places like Libya, in Afghanistan, have deterred the West in those endeavours?
Well, here I take a somewhat contrary view from the previous speakers. I mean, partly because I do recognize the humanitarian needs, but I don't want to discount, the profound economic inequalities and unevenness that characterizes our contemporary world and has characterized our world for centuries. I mean, I think this should take center place in the contemporary debate on the migration crisis. So if you ask me what the EU should do to tackle the root causes, of migration, it's so like asking a fox to guard the hen house, because if by root causes you understand, the underlying structural conditions that, foster, in principle, migration across the world, well, Europe, and not only Europe, has been at the center of creating those causes for several centuries. So it's not a bystander that is called upon to intervene, but, one of the major causes of imbalances, inequalities, and so on. Look, I think ultimately migration is just a mirror of our society. It mirrors our inequalities, our fears. It speaks more about us than it speaks more, than about those who actually migrate. So, on one side, I would say we need to tackle the root structures that cause the causes of migration. But as a stopgap policy, I would just say that facilitating rather than hampering migration should be, and has historically proven to be, the only way in which inequalities can be addressed, in which imbalances, injustices can be addressed. And it has been for centuries a mechanism through which livelihoods and communities have reproduced themselves, and we should cherish that.
Heaven, what do you think? Because there are all kinds of issues we're talking about here: economic, practical, political, human rights. I could go on. Are we getting any closer to balancing those competing demands?
Well, to be honest, I don't think we are. I mean, as I say, after 35 years of working in this space, I don't think we're any closer to balancing these competing demands for a number of different reasons. I think one of the reasons is that this political debate around migration is a complete distraction, essentially, from all sorts of other things that are wrong with societies in Europe, that are struggling with, the healthcare service in the context of an aging population, that are struggling with people who, are on zero-hour contracts and feeling very insecure about their job situation. There is huge inequality within Europe with marginalization. And this, this right-wing agenda that we've been talking about is really because governments are using migration to distract from the things that they're struggling with. And until we can have a kind of honest debate about what migration is really about, along the lines that Paolo was saying in terms of our own issues, then I think it'll be very difficult to balance it. I mean, one of the frustrations I guess I have is that we've done a lot of research on these issues. We know what's going on. We know what the causes and the drivers of migration are. We know what the geopolitical contexts are. We know what works in terms of helping migrants to integrate and become part of a society. We know the answers. It's not through a shortage of evidence about what could or should change. What it is a shortage of political will to want to do things differently. And that's because governments are simply using migration to distract, as I say, from these broader issues. It's much easier to blame migrants than to fix housing or to make good jobs or to sort out the inequalities that we've been hearing about. So there's a political problem here, really, rather than a policy problem. The policy problem, I've said before, in terms of migration, is relatively easy to solve. It's not the case that everybody wants to come to Europe. Most people are very happy and do move within their own context because the migration is a really important part of the development process for them. We need to get out of this idea that everybody wants to come and instead see that this is, as I said earlier, a momentum that is not going to turn back.
Klaus, let me bring you back in on this one, because there's a lot of pressure to reform the whole asylum system and the Refugee Convention, although that's something that the head of the UNHCR, Filippo Grandi, said is a catastrophic error. Is the problem likely to get worse before it gets better?
Well, if we talk about a problem, I think, yes, the problem is getting worse because we will have to deal with, as Heaven said, a constant influx of new citizens, yes, which is actually beneficial to our society. But of course, if you have over 100,000 people, first of all, you have to find housing, integration, education, jobs. It is not that easy. So some of them, of course, live on benefits, sure. And that is the last thing they ever had intended. Now, I think the situation, you come back to Angela Merkel, 2015, wir schaffen das. Yes, of course. She was not addressing the Turkish community, which is extremely well integrated in Germany. She was addressing all the new arrivals coming in particular via the Balkan route at the time, or supposedly the future Balkan route. And the German population at the same time simply said, yes, of course, we will manage. But I said there is no plan B in the drawer in Berlin. What you actually do with these new arrivals, how do you make sure that their life is better than it was before? It's a huge task for any government. But I expect the numbers to rise in the short term. I don't have a crystal ball. Eventually, instead of building new asylum processing centers somewhere on far away or nearby shores, I think our governments and our societies should actually, instead of engaging in neo-colonialism, sorry to be outspoken here, in financing, helping development, making sure that the people do not have a reason to leave their countries anymore. This is the economic dimension, but secondly, of course, I'm not colorblind, there is a political one as well. You can't stop a civil war overnight. We see it day in and day out, unfortunately. And yes, politics and policies. I think that's the only solution.
Klaus Jurgens, Heaven Crawley, Paolo, Novak, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you indeed. Thank you.
Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find more agenda content on CGTN Europe's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram, and YouTube channels. Until next time, goodbye.
The most interesting questions.
Are there other living beings beyond Earth?
Will man or machine be in charge?
Great question.
Always have more than one answer.
Well, hold on, let me just draw up a list.
And always come from more than one person.
That's where the credibility lies.
The concept of having a machinery which is alive and evolving didn't wait for us.
The end of inequality of incomes and wealth around the world, can you imagine how difficult that is at the moment to achieve?
Every episode, Stephen Cole, Murray Beveridge, and some of the brightest minds out there shed light on the answers to some of the most intriguing questions.
There are two ways of looking at this.
Machines can't really discriminate between civilian and military targets.
The Answers Project.
Maybe we need to just look at this in a bit more detail.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The Answers Project, a new podcast from CGTN Europe.